Hello and welcome to DesignOS. Let's understand the properties of the frame tool a little bit better. If we select our frame, there is an auto layout option here, which I'll skip over because auto layout is an amazing feature and deserves a video of its own. After that, we have layout grid. As the name suggests, this makes a grid on our frame. If we click on the plus option here, it will give us a grid on our frame. If you want to turn this grid off, all we have to do is click on this eye toggle and the grid will be turned off. If we want to turn the grid back on, all we have to do is click the eye again. If we want to delete our grid, all we have to do is click on the negative option and our grid will be deleted. So let's go ahead and add the grid back again using the plus option. Let's try to customize this grid. We can customize this by going into the layout grid settings, which is this 3x3 cube icon here. When you click on this icon, it gives us quite a few options. We can change the size of each of these little squares using the size option. So right now we have it set at 10 pixels. Let's make it 20. And that makes the size of each square 20 by 20 pixels. We can change the color of our lines. So right now it's set to red. We can have it something like black. And if we want, we can turn up the opacity by turning this 10% to 100. And that will make our lines a little more opaque. Let's just go back to 10% opacity and make the grid red again. Layout grid also gives us an option for using row or column type grids. Let's take a look at column grids first. So we can go ahead and click on this drop down here and change it to columns. By clicking on that column, as you can see, we changed our grid into a column. First property in our column grid is the count. The count is the number of columns that we have on our frame. So I can change this to something like 10, and that will change the number of columns to 10. We can also change the color similar to the grid option. Next, we have type. By default, it is set at stretch, and that is usually what you'll want to use. The stretch option basically spans the columns from point A, which is the left side of the frame, to point B, which is the right side of the frame, leaving the gutter width that we mentioned as 20 pixels in between all the columns. So if we change the gutter width to something like 10, it will change the width between the columns to 10 pixels. If I change the type from stretch to left, let's see what happens. As you can see, all my columns got aligned to the left side, and now we have the width option available, so I can change the width of each of my columns here. So let's make it into something like 30, and that changes the width of each of my column, leaving the gutter width of 10 pixels between each of my columns. I also have the offset option available, which will make my grid start from a different position. So right now, as you can see, I have the left option selected in my type, so my grid is aligned to the left side. If I change this offset from 0 to 10, it will leave a space of 10 pixels on the left side. You can experiment with the right and the center type of the grid columns. One important property that we have when we select stretch in our column grid is margins. So let's go ahead and select stretch back again, and let's change this margin from 10 to something like 40. And as you can see, there's a margin on the left and the right side of our frame. The use of grids in UI design is to make your design pixel perfect. Grids help you align items better. They let you know if you have something within the safe space of your frame, and in many cases, they allow you to design responsive designs. In Figma, you can stack up many grids on top of each other by pressing the plus button again and again. So right now I have one column selected. I can press the plus button again, and now I have a grid option. I can press the plus button again, and I can change this grid from a grid to rows, and now I have rows, grid, and column setup. You can experiment with rows, grids, and columns as much as you want to be comfortable with layout grid in Figma. So I'll go ahead and delete all my layout grids. Now we can move on to the layers panel. Here we have three options really. First one is the blend mode. If you click on the blend mode drop down, you will see several options. If you have a background in graphic design, you'll recognize these. But going over all of them will take a lot of time. You can select and experiment as you wish with these blend modes. I will link an article from Adobe that you can read through to understand the blending modes a little bit better. Next to blend mode, we have the opacity option. So you can change the opacity of the frame here. Let's just go from 100% to 50%. And that makes my frame a bit gray because my background color is black and my frame color was white. Mixing those two, you get gray. I will hit Ctrl Z to go back to 100%. And the final option in the layers panel is the eye toggle. You can hide or unhide your frame using this. So if I click on the eye toggle, my frame gets hidden. If I click on the eye toggle again, my frame comes back. Let's move on to the fill panel. By default, our frame comes with a fully white fill. We can remove this fill by clicking on this negative button here, and we can add back the fill by clicking on this positive button. We can change the color of our frame by using this rectangular button here and selecting any color that we want. And we can also use the hex code given here or here to change the color. So I can go to something like E5, 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 and change the color of the fill from white to a bit of a gray. Let's go back to a white fill again. We have other options to change the color as well. If we go into the hex code drop down here, we also get RGB. So you can mention the red, green, and blue values. You can also mention CSS, which is basically the same as RGB. So red, green, and blue values. HSL, which is the hue, saturation, and lightness, and HSB, which is the hue, saturation, and brightness. For this course, however, we'll stick to the hex code. Finally, we can take a look at this drop down list here, which says solid by default. This gives us a few options. 4 of them are gradients and 1 of them is the image option. Let's take a look at all the gradients that Figma offers us. So let's go ahead and choose the linear gradient option. As you can see, this forms a flow from one color, which is black in our case, to another color, which is white. One pro tip is to go to a website like uigradients.com. I'll leave a link to that in the description down below. Here you can find beautiful gradients that are already made for you and select whichever one you want to implement. So let's go ahead and explore a few gradients. I like this one, so I'll go ahead and copy the hex code of the first color, which is this one, just by clicking on it and it gets copied. Go back to Figma, change our first color by selecting this rectangle here and changing the hex for that. And going back to UI gradients, copying the second color, coming back to Figma, selecting this one, which is the other color. Go ahead and change the hex code for that and make the opacity 100%. That forms a beautiful gradient that we picked from uigradients.com. We can also change the opacity of either of these colors by using this 100% option and going down to something like, say, 85% or 60%. That changes the opacity of a color. Let's go back to 100%. And that was all about the linear gradient. Let's go ahead and change this from a linear to a radial gradient. And as you can see, this turns our gradient into somewhat of an ellipse. One color flows into the other color in the same way as light is diffused. You can change how fat this ellipse is by using the 2 handles that were provided. So one of those handles is this one and the other is this one. You can change how fat you want your gradient to be using these 2 handles. And if you want this to be a perfect circle, just select one of the handles, hold down shift, and then increase the size or decrease the size and it will turn into a perfect circle. That was the radial gradient. Let's go ahead and change this from radial to angular. It's really quite difficult to explain what an angular gradient really is, but this animation does wonders to explain how we can get an angular gradient. One of the colors basically flows into the other color like a linear gradient, but we take the linear gradient and turn it into a circle and then expand it to fit our frame. Finally, after the angular gradient, we have the diamond gradient, which is basically the same as a radial gradient, except for a circle, it's forming a diamond in the middle. You can change how fat the diamond is using the 2 handles that were provided. And again, if you want the diamond to be perfectly square, you can hold down the shift button and then expand the size and it will be a perfectly square diamond. Our final fill option is the image. So if we go ahead and change from a diamond to an image, Figma will ask us to choose an image. So let's go ahead and click on choose image, which will open an explorer window and we can choose any image that we want. For example, I'll choose this one and you have to give Figma a second to upload the image. And once you get it, your image will be the background of your frame. We have a few options to edit the image over here. So exposure is the brightness of the image. Contrast is how deep you want the blacks to be. Saturation is how much color you want. Temperature is if you want the image to be yellow or blue. If you go to the left side, your image will turn blue. If you go to the right, your image will go yellow. Tint is how red or green you want the image to be. So going to the left side will turn it to green. Going to the right side will turn into red. Highlights is how bright you want the bright spots to be. So if I turn the highlights all the way up, you see the bright spots that were over here are now blown out and quite white. And shadows is how dark you want the blacks to be. So like we have shadows here in the cone. If we go ahead and turn down the shadows, it will turn even more black. And that is the fill image option. We also have the rotate image option. So instead of rotating the entire frame, if you just want to rotate the image inside of the frame, all you have to do is click this button and that will rotate the image 90 degrees inside of the frame without rotating the frame itself. You can go ahead and turn it 180 degrees and again and again. All right. So that's all about the fill panel. Let's talk about the stroke panel now. A stroke is basically an outline of a frame. Let's go ahead and add a stroke to our frame and see what actually happens. We have to zoom in, and as you can see, a black stroke or a black outline has been applied to our frame. We can change this black outline from black to something like red so that it is easier to see, and change the width of the stroke to something like 10 so that it is easier to see when we zoom out. So the options that we have for stroke are obviously the color, so I can change the color. I have the width, so I can change the width from 10 to something like 20, and that changes the width of the stroke. And we also have the placement of the stroke. So the outside option places the stroke or the outline of our frame outside our frame. So as you can see, this little blue line is where our frame ends, and that is where the stroke starts. I can change this from outside to inside, which makes our stroke be on the inside of the frame. So the blue line is where the frame ends, and the stroke is on the inside. And the center option makes our stroke be right on the line. So the blue line is the center. We have 10 pixels on the left side, 10 pixels on the right side. One thing that I would want to talk about here is the outside option. So as you can see, when I click the outside option, the stroke is on the outside of the frame. But if you remember in the last video, when I created a rectangle inside of our frame, and the rectangle flowed a bit outside of our frame, the frame cut it out because I had the clip content property. Well, I still have the clip content property selected right here, but a stroke is still on the outside of the frame. That is because stroke and the clip content property are independent of each other, and the stroke can be outside while clip content is also selected. Now we can move on to the advanced options that we have for stroke. So we can go ahead and click on these three dots here to go to the advanced stroke settings, and we get quite a few options here. First one is cap, which I'll get to in a minute. The next one is join. So we can go ahead and see the first one is the meta join, which we have already selected. This is basically a square join. We can go to bevel, which cuts out a right angle triangle from our stroke. And the last one is round, if you want to have a rounded stroke. Pro tip, if you want to use the meta join and still have a bevel like look, we can change this meta angle from whatever the default is to 90 degrees, and that will change the look of the meta into a bevel. Next, we have dashes. So let's go ahead and change this angle back to 0 degrees and see what the dashes are all about. If we remove the 0, 0, we have dash, comma, gap, example 2, 5 written here. So let's go ahead and input that example over there. And as you can see, there are dashes forming in our stroke. If we zoom in a little bit, we can understand what the 2, 5 means. So 2 is the width of each of the dashes, and 5 is the distance between each dash. So we can change this from 2, 5 to 20, 10. Now every dash is 20 pixels in width and 10 pixels away from each other. That is all about dashes. Now we can go ahead and explore cap a little bit. We can go ahead and change the cap to round and change the distance between each dash to something like 100. And now we can see what cap does. Basically rounds off the end of every path. If you don't really understand what I'm trying to say right now, it's quite fine. We'll understand what cap does in detail when we go ahead and use the path tool over here. We can also change this from round to square, which gives us the usual dashes, and line arrow and triangle arrow are something that we'll explore when we look at paths. So let's go ahead and close this, and we'll remove the stroke. Let's quickly run through some of the effects that Figma has to offer. So first of all, to show the first effect, I'm going to have to change the background color from 2020 back to E5. And now I'll go ahead and select our frame and click on the effects option. So by clicking the plus option, I'll get the first effect, which is drop shadow. If I zoom in, I can see that there is a shadow forming under my frame now. I can go ahead and select frame 1 again, and now I can change the effects of this drop shadow. So first one is the X, which is basically how far away you want your shadow to be from the left to right scale. So if I go ahead and enter 100 over here, you can see that it moved 100 pixels to the right. I can go ahead and change this to -100 to move it 100 pixels to the left. Y is basically the same, except for it's from top to bottom. So if you want your shadow to be 100 pixels downward from your frame, just enter 100 and your shadow will move 100 pixels downward. If I enter -100, it will move my shadow 100 pixels above my frame. That was the X and the Y property. The blur property is how out of focus you want your shadow to be. So I can change from 4 to something like 20, and that will make my shadow go even more out of focus. And the spread is how large you want your shadow to be. So I can change this from 0 to 100, and as you can see, it increases my shadow by a factor of 100 pixels. We also have the color of the shadow. I can change this from a black to a red, and I can also change the opacity. This is basically the same as we discussed for the fill and the stroke panel. We also have blend modes again. I'll again not go over these. If you want, you can read the article from Adobe to understand what these blend modes really do. And that is all about drop shadow. You can go ahead and change the drop shadow into an inner shadow. And as you can see, it's basically the same as a drop shadow, except instead of going outside the frame, it's now inside the frame. So I can change this from a -100 to something like 10, 10, and it changed the blur from 4 and spread from 100 to something like 10 pixels. And as you can see, the shadow remains inside the frame, and this inner shadow follows the clip content option. So the shadow is clipped as soon as it tries to go outside of the frame. I can change this from red to black again and decrease the opacity, maybe increase the blur a little bit, and that was the inner shadow option. Let's go ahead and change this from inner shadow to layer blur. And as you can see, all that layer blur does is make our layer go out of focus. So I can change the blur amount from 24 to something like 4 to decrease the blur, and I can go to 0 to remove the blur outright. I can go to 100 and make the layer go out of focus by quite a bit. And that is all about the layer blur option. We can go ahead and select the background blur option. And as you can see, nothing really changed because background blur is you blurring something behind the frame or behind the layer. So I'll go ahead and remove this, and I'll go ahead and add another frame inside of a frame. So I'll click F and draw a frame again. And as you can see, this frame that I just drew is now inside of a frame 1. If you don't understand what this means, we'll talk about layers later on, but I'll just go ahead and align this to the center. Again, I'll talk about the alignment options later too, and I will add a fill to our frame. And now what I'll go ahead and do is add the background blur option and go ahead and increase this background blur. As you can see, nothing is happening because this layer is completely solid. So I'll go ahead and decrease the opacity to something like 40%. And as you can see, if I remove or if I hide this background blur effect, you can see that this is what it would actually look like if my frame was at 30% opacity of white color. But if I turn the background blur back on, you can see that the background is now blurred. This helps us make some class type effects. You might have seen this done in some of the iOS apps, but we will go ahead and delete this frame and move on to the final panel, which is the export panel. As the name suggests, this panel helps us export our designs into photos, vectors, or PDFs. We can select our current frame and go ahead and click on the plus option, and we get quite a few export options that Figma offers. First one is the scale option. So you can choose to scale up your designs all the way to 4x, or you can just enter a number that you want. So something like 10x can also be done. What this will do is render your frame at 10 times the resolution that you designed it at. But the question is, why would you want to export at 10 times the resolution and not just design at that resolution? Well, that's because of speeds and standards. So speed is quite easy to explain. Creating a bigger design requires more computing power, and your computer may slow down while you have to make edits to your design. The other reason is because most of the industry has some standard sizes. Like all iPhone artboards should be 414 by 896. So if the industry has standard sizes, why would you want to export this iPhone frame at 10 times the size? Well, because of marketing and print material, 414 by 896 is quite low resolution. That is why you would want to export this frame as higher resolution or in a vector format. The suffix option is used to change the name of your file. You can add a suffix like at 10x because your file is being exported at 10x. And finally, you have the file format option. You can change this from PNG, JPEG, SVG, or PDF. SVG is basically a vector graphic. PNG and JPEGs are both image. PNG, however, can hold transparent images, and PDF is your standard PDF. If you have multiple frames, like if I just duplicate this frame by pressing Ctrl D and you select both those frames, you can also export two layers together by clicking this, and you will have two layers downloaded as a zip file.